The gym smelled faintly of sweat and dust, the way it always did after practice in late November. The squeak of sneakers on polished wood had faded, replaced by the low thrum of the overhead lights and the soft echoes of voices carrying down the hallway. It was a normal Thursday for the team, and for 16-year-old Ryan Keller, it was supposed to be another routine night. He was a quiet kid by most accounts, not the star of the team, but steady, dependable, the kind of player coaches trusted to run drills without complaint. He'd stayed a little later than usual, practicing free throws while his teammates joked around and filtered into the locker room. When the others began to leave, Ryan trailed behind, moving at his own pace. A teammate remembered him heading into the locker room with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, saying he'd be out in a few minutes. No one thought much of it. Players often lingered. Some showered, some sat scrolling on their phones until their rides arrived. There was nothing unusual in Ryan being the last one there. Outside in the parking lot, parents waited in idling cars, headlights cutting across the cracked pavement. Most of the boys came out in groups, laughing and calling goodbyes, but Ryan never appeared. His best friend assumed maybe he'd already slipped out a side door, catching a ride with someone else. Another thought he might have stayed behind to talk with the coach. The assumption was easy. Ryan was reliable, never one to stir trouble. If he wasn't out yet, there had to be a reason. But when his mother's car pulled into the lot and the minutes ticked past, concern began to ripple. She sent his sister inside to check. The locker room was quiet by then, benches empty, lockers closed. His bag was gone, which seemed to confirm he had left. Still, no one had seen him walk out, and no cars had pulled away carrying him. The coach, noticing his mother waiting by the curb, walked back inside to double-check. He scanned the gym, the hallways, the bathrooms. Nothing. He returned to the parking lot uneasy, insisting maybe Ryan had left early, but his mother shook her head. She knew her son's routines. He would never leave without telling her. 10 minutes turned into 30. The building was searched again, this time more carefully. Every stall, every storage closet, even the bleachers were checked. The school wasn't large, but its maze of narrow hallways and tucked-away rooms made it feel suddenly vast and uncertain. Teachers still lingering in their offices confirmed they hadn't seen him pass. Doors were locked from the inside. Windows were shut tight against the cold. It was as though Ryan had walked into the locker room and dissolved into air. By 9 o'clock, his parents' worry had reached panic. They called the police. 2 officers arrived first, expecting a simple case of a teenager sneaking off or deciding to walk home. They swept the gym, retraced steps, questioned the coach and players who remained. But the facts didn't add up. If Ryan had left, no one had seen it. If he was hiding, he was nowhere to be found. The officers had the school custodian unlock every door. Storage rooms filled with balls and equipment were emptied, equipment closets checked top to bottom, nothing. The boiler room, with its humming machinery, was empty too. The only trace was absence. His clothes, his shoes, even his backpack, all gone, taken with him as though he had planned to leave. But that idea clashed with everything his parents swore by. He hadn't been upset, hadn't argued, hadn't hinted at wanting to run. Rumors started that very night. Some kids whispered maybe he slipped out the back to meet someone, maybe a girlfriend no one knew about. Others speculated a fight, an ambush in the parking lot. Yet there had been no sounds, no witnesses, and no signs of struggle. The gym, for all its echoes and open spaces, had given away nothing. By midnight, more officers arrived, flashlights slicing through the hallways as they canvassed every corner. The school was sealed, guarded until morning. Parents gathered in the parking lot, clutching coats against the cold, voices low and anxious. Ryan's mother stood closest to the doors, refusing to leave, convinced her son had to be inside somewhere. But the building remained silent, stubbornly withholding its secrets. The town awoke the next day to the news. A boy had disappeared from inside the high school. No trace, no witnesses, no explanation. It was the kind of story that felt impossible, the kind that shouldn't happen in a small, familiar place. Teachers looked at the empty seat in homeroom. Students traded fragments of speculation, each version wilder than the last. What stood out most, though, was how ordinary the night had seemed until it wasn't. There had been no alarm, no visible danger. Just a boy finishing practice, walking into a locker room, and never walking out again. The absence became the center of everything. Flyers were printed overnight, his photo taped to every storefront and gas station in town. Volunteers assembled to search the surrounding woods, convinced he must have wandered off. But those closest to the case couldn't shake a single troubling thought. If Ryan never left the school, then where had he gone? And how could someone vanish without a single sound inside a locked building filled with people only minutes before? That haunting question would become the seed of a mystery that would consume the community for years to come. And it would begin with the simple, unsettling truth that Ryan Keller walked into a locker room and never came back out. The first uniformed officers stepped into the school just before midnight, their radios crackling softly against the heavy silence of the building. They had been called for missing juveniles before, but this one carried a different weight. Ryan Keller hadn't vanished from a busy street or from his own home. He had disappeared inside a locked public building. The officers expected to find a simple explanation, a teenager hiding with friends or slipping out unnoticed. But from the moment they began their search, it became clear this case was not going to resolve so neatly. They started where he was last seen, the locker room. The tiled floors were clean, no drag marks or scuffs. The benches were empty, the lockers closed, and the faint smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. His teammates repeated the same story. They had seen him go in, but none had seen him leave. The officers traced every possible path out of the gym. Doors were checked for tampering, but the locks were intact. Windows were tested and found sealed tight against the cold. No footprints led away from the entrances. It was as if the walls had swallowed him. The discovery that his bag and clothes were missing shifted the tone of the search. To some investigators, it suggested he had walked out under his own power, taking his things with him. But when pressed, every teammate insisted he had never emerged. Several parents waiting outside swore they hadn't seen anyone resembling Ryan exit the building. In a town this small, faces were familiar. No one could imagine how he could have slipped past unnoticed. By morning, the search widened. Detectives were called in, canvassing the area and pulling security footage from the school's few aging cameras. Grainy black and white video showed the parking lot, the main entrance, and part of the side hallways. Teammates could be seen leaving in groups, parents collecting their kids, headlights sweeping across the lot. But Ryan never appeared on any frame. It was an absence that became more haunting the longer investigators studied it. As the hours stretched into a full day, the story hit local radio and television. A 16-year-old had vanished without a trace from inside his own school. Reporters framed it as a mystery, emphasizing the locked doors, the lack of forced entry, the impossibility of the scenario. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. Some whispered that Ryan had run away, planning it in secret, taking his things so he couldn't be tracked. Others argued it was an abduction, that someone had found a way to pull him out of the building without being seen. And then there were stranger theories. Hidden tunnels, forgotten exits sealed off decades ago, places a boy could slip through and never be found. The Keller family faced cameras that evening. Ryan's parents stood side by side in front of their home, voices breaking as they begged for his safe return. His mother clutched a recent school photo while his father spoke directly to the camera, insisting Ryan was not a runaway, insisting he had no reason to leave. They asked anyone with information to come forward. It was the first time the wider world saw the raw grief behind the headlines. The school itself became a focal point. Investigators walked through every room, unlocking supply closets and storage areas, even the attic space above the gym. Nothing pointed to a struggle, no blood, no signs of violence. The theory of an abduction seemed difficult to sustain. How could someone take a teenager from inside a school without noise, without evidence, without witnesses? Yet the theory of him leaving willingly seemed equally implausible. Friends described him as steady, responsible, close with his family. There were no text messages, no social media posts hinting at a plan. His bank account was untouched. His bicycle remained in the garage. The balance between these two impossible scenarios unsettled everyone. If Ryan had run away, Why hadn't he surfaced? If he had been taken, how had no one noticed? Each possibility carried its own chilling weight. Detectives began questioning staff members, focusing on who had keys, who had remained in the building after hours. The janitor's name was raised early, since he'd been responsible for closing the facility that night. He denied seeing Ryan, insisting he had been working in another wing of the school. His story was consistent, but suspicions lingered quietly among parents and classmates. As media attention grew, the case began drawing comparisons to other high-profile disappearances. Television anchors speculated about predators, about unsafe school practices, about the possibility of an inside job. The town felt suddenly exposed, its safety questioned by outsiders who saw only the headline, "A boy had vanished from inside a school, and no one knew how." At night, volunteers gathered with flashlights to comb through nearby woods and abandoned buildings. Search dogs were brought in but failed to pick up a scent past the school's doors. Every dead end added another layer of fear, another layer of disbelief. The phrase, "last seen entering the locker room," became a grim refrain repeated in news segments and police briefings. Despite the growing tension, some clung to hope. Ryan's parents continued to believe he might be alive, maybe hiding, maybe held somewhere. They gave interviews, passed out flyers, retraced his steps. His mother drove daily to the school parking lot, sitting in silence as if waiting for him to walk out. His father pressed police for updates, struggling to balance faith with the gnawing suspicion that the truth was far darker than anyone wanted to admit. The investigation stalled as quickly as it began. Theories clashed, rumors multiplied, and the absence of evidence became the story itself. The building had been searched top to bottom, yet Ryan Keller was nowhere inside. There was no sign he had ever left. The contradiction hung over the case, impossible to resolve. And as days turned into weeks, the fear grew sharper. If he hadn't walked out on his own, then someone had found a way to take him. But who and how remained hidden in the silence of those hallways, silence that would come to haunt the case for years to come. The first week after Ryan Keller's disappearance passed in a haze of constant searching and mounting fear. Patrol cars lingered outside the school around the clock, their flashing lights washing across brick walls that had already been scoured top to bottom. With no signs inside, investigators widened their focus outward. The wooded areas beyond the football field were combed by deputies and volunteers, a line of bodies spaced shoulder to shoulder, calling his name into the emptiness. Helicopters circled above, scanning from the sky for any sign of movement, any scrap of color against the late autumn landscape. As each hour passed without results, the urgency deepened. The county sheriff held press conferences, assuring the community that no effort was being spared. But privately, detectives admitted they had little to work with. No witnesses had come forward, no vehicles were reported leaving suspiciously, and no neighbors recalled hearing shouts or struggles that night. The school surveillance tapes showed nothing but ordinary departures. Ryan's vanishing had left no trail. 2 days in, investigators turned their attention to water. A pond on the edge of town, used in summer by kids for fishing and swimming, became the next focus. Divers moved slowly through the icy water, while residents stood at the shoreline holding their breath. The fear was that Ryan had somehow walked there on his own and drowned. When the divers surfaced empty-handed, relief mixed uneasily with frustration. Every location checked without results was one more confirmation of how little sense the case made. By the end of the second week, the search had expanded across the county. Farmlands were driven through, ditches checked, abandoned barns opened and searched. Deputies logged hundreds of hours, but came away with nothing more than a growing list of dead ends. The absence of evidence was suffocating, and it began to direct suspicion inward. If Ryan had not left traces in the outside world, then the answer had to be within the walls of the school, or among the people inside it. Attention turned first to the students who had been in the locker room that night. Detectives interviewed them multiple times, looking for inconsistencies, for the smallest slip that might suggest one of them knew more than they were saying. But each account held steady. Ryan had walked into the locker room after practice, and no one saw him walk out. They had left, expecting him to follow, and when he didn't, they thought nothing of it until later. None of them could explain the gap between entering and vanishing. Teachers and staff were also scrutinized. The head coach provided his timeline, admitting he left the gym before Ryan's mother arrived, assuming the boy was still in the locker room. His story checked out, but doubts lingered. How could a coach not account for one of his players? And then there was the janitor. He had been working in the ET building that night, making rounds, unlocking and relocking doors. By his own admission, he was one of the last adults in the gym. Detectives pressed him hard, aware of the public's growing suspicion. Rumors painted him as odd, too quiet, too familiar with the building's hidden spaces. Parents whispered at school board meetings, demanding answers, hinting that he knew more than he admitted. He denied everything. He had seen Ryan earlier in the evening, he said, but not after the boy went into the locker room. He claimed he was working in a separate hallway when the disappearance occurred. His keys were checked, his schedule verified. No evidence tied him to Ryan's absence. Still, the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted. Theories multiplied as the search stretched on. Some insisted Ryan had left willingly, running away from home despite what his parents believed. They pointed to his missing bag and clothes as proof he had prepared. But the theory faltered against his character. Steady grades, close ties to family, no known conflicts. Others argued an abduction had taken place, but who could walk into a school filled with students and parents, take a 16-year-old, and vanish without leaving marks or witnesses? The most disturbing theory was whispered among parents and students alike, that something had happened inside the school itself. Not outside in the woods or on a lonely road, but within those walls. That theory carried its own horror. If true, then Ryan had been taken not by chance, but by someone who knew the building intimately, someone who had time, opportunity, and the ability to keep the truth hidden. Weeks became months, and the case shifted from active search to ongoing investigation. The initial waves of volunteers dwindled as lives had to return to normal, though no one in town truly moved on. Every parent glanced twice at their child when dropping them off at school. Every creak of the gym's old rafters seemed ominous. The locker room where Ryan had last been seen was scrubbed clean, reopened for daily use, but no one walked through those doors without unease. Detectives kept files open on every lead, chasing tips from psychics, supposed sightings, anonymous callers claiming to know where Ryan was. Each tip ended the same way. Empty roads, strangers with no connection, silence. The sheriff's office began to admit the possibility that they might never find him. But for Ryan's parents, the idea of surrender was unthinkable. They continued to call the station weekly, continued to post flyers long after the paper had yellowed. His father retraced search areas on weekends. His mother held onto his room exactly as he had left it, convinced he would come home. Their grief, raw and consuming, became another layer of the mystery. Proof that Ryan was not a runaway, that someone had taken him, and that somewhere the truth was still hidden. And though no one could prove it, whispers about the janitor lingered like a shadow. If Ryan hadn't left the building, if he hadn't been taken by someone outside, then suspicion naturally circled back to the man with the keys, the man who knew the school's locked doors and quiet corners better than anyone else. The problem was that suspicion wasn't evidence, and without evidence the case stood still. The absence stretched longer, the unanswered questions multiplying. And as the first year mark approached with no resolution, the unshakable feeling remained. Whatever had happened to Ryan Keller, it had not happened far away. It had happened right there, inside walls that still refused to give up their secrets. By the time spring turned to summer, the school had settled into a strained routine, though nothing felt the same. Ryan Keller's name was still spoken daily, though never in the present tense. His disappearance had etched itself into the very walls of the high school, a ghostly presence that lingered even when classes carried on as usual. Students walked the hallways but never forgot what had happened in November, that one of their own had gone into the locker room and never come back out. The police investigation had slowed, Updates came less frequently, and with every passing week the focus shifted. Parents remained desperate, detectives still followed leads, but among the students, the story had already become something else. It morphed into rumor, into hushed speculation that passed from locker to locker. The official search may have grown quiet, but in the minds of teenagers, Ryan's absence became a haunting legend. Stories began to circulate about the locker room itself. Some kids claimed that late at night, when the gym sat empty, you could hear banging sounds echoing from the pipes, as though someone were striking them from the inside. Others whispered about muffled voices, faint but distinct, seeping from the tiled ceiling above the showers. A few even claimed they had seen shadows move across the floor when no one else was inside. To outsiders, these were typical teenage exaggerations, but inside the school they carried weight. Students avoided being the last to leave practice. Some skipped using the locker room entirely, choosing instead to change clothes at home. Teachers and staff brushed off the stories as superstition, the natural outgrowth of fear in the absence of answers. They pointed to creaking pipes, settling walls, the ordinary sounds of an aging building. But no amount of rational explanation could erase the unease. For many parents, the whispers raised a sharper concern, that the school was not just haunted by rumor, but by something far more real. Over time, the administration began making quiet changes. A new coat of paint was applied to the locker room, covering cracks in the walls that had once been harmless, but now drew stares. Old doors were replaced, hinges and locks upgraded. Ceiling tiles that had stained from years of water damage were swapped out for new ones. On the surface, the renovations looked like routine maintenance, but to those already suspicious, they looked like concealment. Why update a building in pieces rather than all at once? Why focus specifically on the locker rooms and gym? Parents voiced their unease at school board meetings. They asked if the renovations were tied to the investigation, if something had been found and wasn't being shared. Administrators denied it, insisting the updates were long overdue. But the timing was too precise, too coincidental for many to accept. For a community already fractured by unanswered questions, each fresh coat of paint looked like another layer of secrecy. Students who had once laughed about ghosts in the hallways now spoke with more caution. Some described sudden drafts that came from nowhere, a chill that passed over them while they dressed after practice. Others swore that when they stood alone at their lockers, they felt as though someone was watching from above. Whether fueled by grief, imagination, or something more, the whispers grew louder than the facts. By fall, a full year had passed. The missing posters had faded, the nightly news no longer ran regular updates, and yet the story lived on more vividly than ever inside the school walls. New students entered, already familiar with the legend before their first day. For them, Ryan Keller was less a peer than a warning, proof that safety could dissolve without reason. Some of them dared each other to linger in the locker room after practice, waiting for the pipes to rattle or for voices to stir. A few claimed they heard it. Most swore they never would. The Keller family carried the weight in a different way. Ryan's mother grew increasingly vocal about her belief that the school knew more than it was admitting. She spoke at meetings, gave interviews, demanded further searches of the gym. The sight of new paint on the walls only deepened her conviction that something had been covered up. Investigators insisted they had combed every inch of the building, but her faith in official explanations had long since eroded. The staff grew weary of the whispers, the suspicion, the way parents watched them with narrowed eyes. The janitor, already scrutinized early on, avoided conversation with students, though this only fueled further gossip. His quiet presence, moving alone through the building at night, became its own unsettling image. Some students swore he knew where Ryan had gone, that he guarded the secret behind closed doors and locked storage rooms. What was once a search for a missing boy had become something harder to control, a cultural wound inside the school. Students passed through the same halls daily, but now every sound carried double meaning, every unexplained noise a reminder. Silence in the locker room was no longer comfort, but dread. Even years later, alumni would remember that feeling more clearly than their classes or their games. For all the theories, the evidence remained unchanged. No new discoveries surfaced, no hidden doorways were found, no stranger was arrested. Only the unease grew. The official record insisted Ryan had walked into the locker room and vanished. The unofficial story, whispered from student to student, insisted he was still there somehow, trapped, hidden, or silenced within the walls that were slowly being patched and repainted. The truth lay buried somewhere between superstition and fact, but no one could reach it. And every renovation, every fresh layer of plaster only buried it deeper. It was as though the building itself had chosen to guard its secret. As another school year began, and the whispers refused to die, one question remained constant, echoing louder than all the others. If Ryan had never left the building, then why had no one ever found him? At first, Ryan Keller's disappearance pulled his family closer together. In those early weeks, his parents clung to one another, staying up through the night by the phone, waiting for news that never came. They moved as a unit through press conferences, through interviews, through search gatherings, repeating his name like a lifeline. But as the weeks stretched into months and hope began to fracture, the weight of uncertainty turned inward. The Keller home, once warm and steady, began to feel like a hollowed-out shell. Ryan's bedroom remained untouched, his basketball shoes still by the door, his backpack leaning against the desk where he had left it. His mother refused to move anything, insisting it had to stay ready for him when he returned. His father quietly disagreed, but said nothing, not wanting to ignite another fight. It was the silence, more than words, that began to divide them. Investigators, still desperate for leads, turned their attention to the family itself. Detectives came back with sharper questions, digging into the private lives of the Kellers. Had there been arguments at home? Had Ryan shown signs of unhappiness? Was there anything that might point to him running away? Each line of questioning felt like an accusation. His mother bristled at the implication, while his father answered with clipped frustration. Their marriage, already strained by grief, was now burdened by suspicion from the very people they had trusted to find their son. Neighbors whispered too. Some speculated that Ryan might have left because of something inside the home, that maybe the perfect family image masked deeper dysfunction. But the deeper investigators dug, the less they found. No signs of abuse, no evidence of neglect. Teachers described Ryan as well-adjusted, reliable, close with his family. Friends said he never hinted at wanting to leave. The theory of a runaway began to collapse under the weight of absence. Absence not just of evidence, but of motive. Inside the house, the tension between Ryan's parents grew sharper. His mother clung fiercely to the belief that he had been taken, that the school held. Answers it wasn't revealing. She attended every school board meeting, wrote letters to local officials, and called the sheriff's office almost daily. His father, while equally desperate, leaned toward acceptance of darker possibilities, though he rarely admitted it aloud. He withdrew into himself, spending long hours in the garage, leaving his wife to her crusade. Their grief no longer bound them together, but pushed them further apart. Ryan's younger sister, only 11 at the time, grew up under the shadow of the mystery. At school, she was known not for her own achievements, but as the sister of the boy who vanished. Teachers treated her with quiet sympathy, classmates with awkward curiosity. At home, she watched her parents unravel, each consumed by their own version of the truth. She listened to the whispers at school and carried them back, fueling her own conviction that the story of the locker room was not complete. She insisted, even years later, that something inside that building had been missed, that the truth had been hidden just out of reach. Holidays became unbearable. Birthdays passed in silence. Every empty chair at the dinner table was a reminder of what was missing. His mother began setting a place for him anyway, a ritual that only deepened the divide between her and her husband. Arguments flared over whether to keep his belongings untouched or pack them away, whether to cling to hope or accept the unknown. The house became a battlefield, fought in whispers and slammed doors. For the investigators, the Keller family represented both tragedy and frustration. They had nothing to suggest wrongdoing inside the home, but the absence of answers elsewhere kept the family under scrutiny. Files noted the father's growing distance, the mother's obsessive determination, the sister's quiet insistence that the school was hiding something. But none of it moved the case forward. It only documented the slow collapse of a family under unbearable weight. As the years passed, the divide became permanent. His mother continued her fight publicly, never letting Ryan's name fade from community memory. His father retreated more each year, speaking less, allowing silence to stand in for grief. His sister grew into adulthood, marked by a single fact. She was the girl whose brother had vanished, whose family had never recovered. The house they had once shared no longer felt like a home, but a monument to unanswered questions. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized the truth was not inside the Keller household. The family bore the scars, but they had not created the wound. Their lives were defined by loss, not by secrets. And yet, as the official investigation grew colder, the family remained the only constant focus, grieving, fractured, but unwilling to let go. By the time the first decade without Ryan had passed, the Kellers were no longer spoken of as a family, but as individuals. His mother remained vocal in the EBO community, his father isolated, his sister quietly pursuing her own search for answers. They lived parallel lives, bound only by absence. And through it all, the suspicion that something inside the school had never been told remained the quiet refrain of every conversation, every memory, every unanswered prayer. Even without evidence, the family's conviction held steady. If Ryan had not run away, if he had not been found outside, then the only place left was the building where he was last seen. And if that was true, then someone had to know what had happened there, someone who had kept silent while their family unraveled. 14 years passed, and though time dulled the sharp edges of the case, it never erased it. For the Keller family, the absence was permanent. For the town, it became a wound that never quite healed. People had grown older, graduated, moved away, built families of their own. But the name Ryan Keller still lingered like unfinished business. His classmates, now in their 30s, carried the memory of that night as an uneasy shadow. They could recall the squeak of sneakers on the gym floor, the slam of lockers closing, the certainty that Ryan had been with them until the moment he wasn't. Even years later, they could not explain how one of their own had disappeared without a trace inside a locked building. The high school gymnasium, though updated, still stood as the centerpiece of the town. The exterior brick had been repointed, new lockers lined the hallways, and fresh coats of paint brightened spaces that once felt heavy with suspicion. Students who walked those halls now were too young to remember Ryan, though they had heard the stories. They knew the locker room carried a legend, and that some parents still eyed the place warily. For them, it was folklore, but for the adults who remembered, it was history carved deep into the town's conscience. By the 14th year, the building was due for another renovation. The school board approved upgrades to improve plumbing and replace the aging ceiling panels in the locker rooms. For the staff overseeing the work, it was routine maintenance, another step in keeping the facility safe. For the community, it was unremarkable, just another improvement to a building that had always required attention. No one expected the past to come surging back. Construction crews arrived early in the summer, long after classes had ended. With the building empty, workers moved quickly, removing old fixtures, replacing lights, and pulling down stained ceiling tiles. Dust fell in clouds as panels were pried loose, one after another. It was tedious work until, in a corner above the locker benches, one of the men pushed aside a panel and paused. Wedged in the narrow crawl space above the ceiling was a cluster of objects coated in years of dust. At first glance, they looked like debris left from previous work. But when the worker reached in and pulled them free, the sight froze him in place. There was fabric, torn and frayed, faded beyond recognition but clearly once clothing. A plastic water bottle cracked and brittle from time, and then a sneaker, worn and dirty, but still bearing faint initials scrawled in marker on the heel, RK. The worker's hands shook as he lowered the items, unsure of what he had found, but certain it wasn't ordinary. Within an hour, word had spread through the construction crew. By the end of the day, detectives who had not spoken Ryan Keller's name in years were back inside the gym, sealing off the locker room. Forensic teams arrived swiftly, carrying equipment that hadn't existed when Ryan vanished. They cordoned off the space, photographed every angle, and carefully retrieved the objects from the crawl space. The sneaker was bagged separately, its faded initials a chilling reminder of a boy who had been declared missing 14 years earlier. The fragments of fabric were analyzed on site. Dust samples were taken, every scrap documented. The water bottle, though cracked, was preserved as well. For investigators, it was the first tangible evidence tied directly to Ryan Keller since the night he disappeared. The discovery spread through the town with the force of a storm. Neighbors called one another, former classmates texted late into the night, news crews appeared outside the school within 24 hours, broadcasting live from the parking lot that had once been filled with search parties. Parents who had once begged for answers now stood in silence, staring at the building that seemed finally to have given up one of its secrets. For Ryan's family, the call from detectives was devastating and electrifying all at once. After years of silence, there was suddenly proof that he had been inside that building far longer than anyone had allowed themselves to believe. His mother wept at the confirmation that her instincts had been right, that the school held answers. His father, long withdrawn from public appearances, sat quietly, unable to decide if the discovery meant closure or fresh torment. His sister, now an adult, saw in the object's validation of what she had always suspected, that Ryan had never left the building at all. The crawl space itself became a crime scene. Investigators climbed into the narrow void, measuring its dimensions, noting its inaccessibility. It was unfinished, dusty, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Questions mounted quickly. How had Ryan gotten there, and why had no one searched it before? Was it possible he had climbed up himself, or had someone forced him into the space? Theories that had lain dormant for more than a decade roared back to life, each more unsettling than the last. Detectives began re-examining old case files, cross-referencing with the new evidence. They spoke again with the retired janitor, the coaches, and even former classmates who had scattered across the country. Everyone was asked to recall details that time had long eroded. But the objects pulled from the ceiling tiles provided the first hard anchor in years, proof that Ryan's story had not ended the night he walked into the locker room. It had continued, hidden just above everyone's heads. The return of detectives to the school sent waves of unease through the community. Parents who once tolerated the rumors now wondered how such a space had gone unnoticed. Teachers who had worked in the building during those years were forced to confront the possibility that the truth had been inches away the entire time. And for those who had once dismissed the whispers of banging pipes and muffled voices, the discovery made the stories impossible to ignore. The case that had once gone silent was alive again. Forensic labs held the objects now, ready to test fibers, scrape dust, and search for DNA. Detectives whispered about what else might be in that crawl space, about whether the boy who had vanished had spent his final moments trapped above the locker room ceiling. And as the town watched from a distance, one question grew louder than all the rest. If Ryan Keller had been hidden above the ceiling for 14 years, then who had put him there? And why had it taken so long for anyone to look? When investigators pulled down more of the ceiling tiles, what they uncovered was more than just a space above the lockers. It was a crawl space, barely tall enough for a person to move through, rough beams crisscrossing like a cage, wires dangling, and decades of dust coating every surface. It had no flooring, just insulation and joists, the kind of place no one would ever think to look unless they were repairing the building. Yet, hidden inside it, pressed against the beams, were objects that could not be mistaken for construction debris. The first was a scrap of fabric, shredded and frayed, but still holding enough color and weave to suggest it had once been part of a t-shirt. Next was a plastic water bottle, cracked and yellowed with age, its label long faded. Then came the sneaker, a size consistent with a teenager's, the rubber peeling, the canvas worn thin. Along the back heel, nearly erased by time, faint letters could still be seen. R.K. Even after 14 years, the initials were visible, hand-drawn in permanent marker. Detectives who had long since moved on to other cases stood silently in the locker room, staring up at the evidence bagged and lowered from the crawl space. Forensic teams quickly sealed the area and began documenting every inch. Ladders were brought in, photographs taken, dust samples scraped into sterile containers. It was clear from the start that this was no ordinary discovery. These were not forgotten belongings or discarded trash. They were the possessions of Ryan Keller, hidden in a place no one had thought to check during the original investigation. The discovery reignited speculation immediately. Some believed Ryan had climbed into the crawl space himself, maybe as a prank, maybe hiding for reasons no one understood, and had become trapped. Others suspected something darker, that he had been forced there by someone else, deliberately concealed above the ceiling tiles. The space was difficult to access. Investigators noted that to climb up, a person would need to step onto the lockers, push aside a panel, and hoist themselves into the narrow gap. It was not a place someone stumbled into casually. For the Keller family, the phone call from detectives brought a rush of emotions that words could not contain. His mother's voice cracked when she heard the description of the sneaker with his initials. She had written those letters herself years earlier when Ryan first joined the basketball team, marking his shoes to keep them from being lost. For her, the item was proof not only that the evidence was real, but that her son had indeed been left inside the building all along. His father, usually reserved, sat in silence for hours, staring at the floor, unable to reconcile the fact that the answers had been hidden overhead for more than a decade. His sister, now an adult, cried with both relief and anger. Relief that her instincts had been right. Anger that no one had listened when she insisted something in the school had been overlooked. The community, too, was shaken. For years, the whispers had lingered, about strange sounds in the locker room, about muffled voices and banging pipes. Now those stories carried new weight. Had the students really heard something all those years ago? Had Ryan been so close, hidden just above their heads, while everyone convinced themselves it was imagination? Parents confronted the school board again, demanding to know why such a space had not been searched. Administrators could only say the crawl space had not been considered accessible during the original investigation. That explanation felt hollow in the face of what had been found. News spread quickly beyond the town. Reporters returned, cameras lining the school parking lot just as they had in the first days after Ryan vanished. Headlines declared the case reopened. Forensic experts appeared on television, debating the possibilities. Could a boy have survived in such a space, even briefly? Was it a hiding place chosen voluntarily, or a prison forced upon him? And why had no one thought to look up? Inside the school, the investigation grew intense. Every inch of the crawl space was examined. Workers removed additional panels, extending the search along the length of the locker room. Dust-covered beams were checked for signs of disturbance. Fibers were collected, air samples taken. Forensic technicians even sifted through the insulation, hoping to recover fragments that time might have preserved. The atmosphere was heavy. Each new bagged item carried out under the gaze of detectives who understood the magnitude of what had been uncovered. The janitor, once a figure of suspicion, was again questioned. He insisted he had never looked into the crawl space, never even considered it. But the fact that he had held keys, that he had known the building better than most, placed him once again under the weight of community speculation. People wondered if he had known more than he admitted, if he had walked past that space countless times knowing what it concealed. He denied it, but the timing, the access, and the history made him impossible to dismiss. For Ryan's former classmates, now scattered across the country, the news struck like a thunderclap. Many had long since built new lives, yet the announcement pulled them instantly back to the night of his disappearance. Social media filled with memories of his laugh, of practice sessions, of the last moments when he was seen walking into the locker room. And behind every post was the same unspoken question. If the ceiling had been searched in those first days, Would the truth have been revealed then? The discovery of the sneaker, the bottle, and the fabric was more than evidence. It was confirmation that the mystery was never outside the school walls. It had been inside all along, hidden in a space no one had thought to consider. The objects were small, ordinary in appearance, but together they shifted the weight of the entire case. As the crawl space was sealed off again, guarded under evidence tape, detectives prepared to reopen the investigation formally. They knew the hardest questions still lay ahead. Had Ryan Keller hidden there by choice? Had he been trapped by accident? Or had someone years ago deliberately forced him into that space, sealing him away where no one would find him? The community braced itself for answers it had long demanded, but no longer knew if it wanted to hear. The evidence pulled from the crawl space was carefully transported to the state crime lab, each item sealed and labeled. For 14 years, the case had been defined by what investigators didn't have. Now, for the first time, they held something tangible. The sneaker, the fabric scrap, the brittle water bottle, ordinary objects on their own, but collectively a breakthrough. Within weeks, the results began coming back, and with them, answers no one in the community was prepared to hear. The lab's textile experts confirmed the fibers from the fabric matched the clothing Ryan had been wearing the night he disappeared. Witnesses had described a white t-shirt and basketball shorts. Under microscopes, the weave of the recovered scrap aligned perfectly with the shirt his parents had provided years earlier from another set. Time had discolored it, but the origin was unmistakable. The sneaker carried even greater weight. DNA swabs taken from inside confirmed it belonged to Ryan Keller. It wasn't just his initials scrawled on the heel. It was his sweat, his skin cells, still embedded in the fabric after more than a decade. But the most unsettling discovery came last. Wedged deep between a support beam and the insulation, technicians uncovered what at first looked like splintered debris. Under closer examination, the fragments were revealed to be bone, small, brittle, and degraded, but undeniably human. DNA analysis confirmed the fragments belonged to Ryan. The implication was devastating. He hadn't simply hidden his belongings in the crawl space, he had been there himself. The revelation forced investigators to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the case. If Ryan had been in that crawl space, how had no one heard him? How had a full-scale search missed him? And most importantly, how had he gotten there in the first place? The space was described by experts as nearly inaccessible without significant effort. It required climbing onto the lockers, lifting the tiles, and hoisting oneself up into a narrow gap filled with beams and wires. For a 16-year-old boy to do that alone seemed unlikely. To remain there until death was unthinkable. The working theories began to shift. One possibility was that Ryan had been chased, perhaps by another student or staff member, and had fled upward in desperation. If he had pulled himself into the crawl space to escape, it could explain why he never emerged. But the crawl space was not designed for human movement. Once inside, maneuvering would have been extremely difficult. Investigators speculated he could have become trapped, disoriented, or injured. The water bottle suggested he had at least attempted to sustain himself, though no one knew how long he could have survived. The darker theory, whispered among detectives, was that he hadn't climbed up there at all, that he had been placed there by someone else. The crawl space was not the kind of location a frightened teenager would instinctively choose, but it was the kind of place someone with knowledge of the building might use to conceal another person. The question then shifted. If Ryan had been hidden, who had done it, and why had the space been left untouched for 14 years? The discovery of bone fragments intensified suspicion around those who had worked in the school at the time. Investigators re-interviewed the janitor, pressing him on whether he had ever entered the crawl space or noticed disturbed tiles. He repeated his earlier denials, insisting he had no knowledge of it. But experts noted that custodial staff would have had ladders and access that most students did not. The implication was not lost on the community. Once again, his name surfaced in whispers, though there was still no evidence tying him directly. Theories swirled among the public. Some clung to the idea that Ryan had chosen to hide, that he had been playing a prank or avoiding someone, and that the situation had spiraled tragically out of control. Others argued the evidence pointed unmistakably to foul play, that no boy would willingly crawl into such a space and stay there until death. Parents began asking difficult questions of the school board. Why hadn't the crawl space been searched at the time? Why had routine maintenance not uncovered it sooner? The answers were unsatisfying. Protocols hadn't considered the area accessible, and the building had simply been assumed clear. For Ryan's family, the lab results landed like a second disappearance. His mother, though vindicated in her belief that he had never left the school, now faced the crushing confirmation that he had died inside it. His father struggled with the logistics, unable to understand how an entire community could search so thoroughly and still miss what was right above their heads. His sister, angry and heartbroken, said aloud what many feared, that someone had known and had kept the truth hidden all these years. The crawl space itself became a symbol of both neglect and secrecy. Investigators released diagrams to the public showing just how narrow and suffocating it was. Experts explained that for Ryan to have entered and remained there, assistance or force was likely involved. Theories of entrapment gained traction. If he had been lured there, perhaps under threat, he could have been unable to escape. If someone had sealed the tiles after placing him there, the act would have been deliberate. The renewed investigation pushed deeper into old files. Detectives reread witness statements, looking for inconsistencies they had missed as young officers. They found mentions of students hearing strange noises in the days after Ryan vanished, reports that had been dismissed as rumor. Now those accounts seemed less like stories and more like missed opportunities. If he had been alive for even a short time in that crawl space, those noises might have been his attempts to be heard. The forensic evidence had answered the question of where Ryan ended up, but it left the how and why shrouded in even darker uncertainty. Investigators knew only this: Ryan Keller had not walked away from his school that night. He had been in the ceiling above the locker room, hidden in plain sight, until time and decay reduced him to fragments. Whether he had climbed there in fear or been forced there in violence remained the puzzle they were desperate to solve. And as the case reopened in full, the community that had once whispered about ghosts in the hallways now whispered about something far worse: the possibility that someone had known the truth all along and had chosen silence while a family unraveled and a boy remained trapped above them. When the bone fragments confirmed that Ryan Keller had died inside the school, investigators knew they had to go back to the very beginning. Every statement, every witness, every detail from the original case file was reopened. The focus quickly narrowed to a name that had never fully escaped suspicion: the janitor who had worked in the building that night. 14 years earlier, he had been questioned extensively, but with no evidence tying him to Ryan's disappearance, the investigation moved past him. Now retired, and living in a small house on the edge of town, he had built a quiet life, rarely seen outside his property. Detectives arrived one morning, unannounced, to find him sitting on the porch. When they asked if he would answer questions about the night Ryan vanished, he hesitated, then agreed. The interview was different this time. Armed with new evidence, investigators pressed harder. They reminded him of his access to the building, his master keys, his responsibility for locking up after practices. They brought up his disciplinary record, complaints from students about inappropriate comments, warnings from administrators about being present in the gym long after hours, subtle but consistent red flags that had never escalated to criminal charges. Each fact landed heavier now, framed against the knowledge of where Ryan had been found. At first, he repeated the same story he had given years ago. He had been cleaning another wing of the school, had not seen Ryan after practice, and knew nothing about his disappearance. But the detectives didn't stop. They brought up the crawl space. They asked him directly if he had ever known it existed. For the first time, his composure cracked. He admitted he had known about it. Maintenance staff had mentioned it years earlier, a narrow void above the ceiling that could be accessed if tiles were lifted. When pressed on why he hadn't shared that information during the original investigation, his answer was unsettling in its simplicity. He said he never thought they'd look there. The detectives pressed harder. What did he mean by that? Why had he assumed it wasn't worth mentioning? His explanation faltered. He claimed it had slipped his mind, that it was just another forgotten feature of an old building. But his body language betrayed him, shifting in his chair, avoiding eye contact, speaking more quickly. The detectives knew the story was beginning to unravel. Back at the station, they dug deeper into his employment records. What they found painted a troubling picture. He had worked at multiple schools over the years, leaving more than one position after complaints from staff or parents. None of the complaints had led to criminal charges, but they revealed a pattern: boundary issues with students, a tendency to linger in locker rooms after practices, unexplained absences from his assigned duties. Administrators had documented their concerns, but each time the issues were smoothed over quietly. With this history laid bare, the community's suspicion reignited. Parents who had children in the school at the time remembered their unease. Former students shared stories of his presence, the way he seemed to appear unexpectedly, his watchful eyes as they left practice late. Individually, the anecdotes seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern that felt impossible to dismiss. Detectives returned to confront him again. They asked about the night of Ryan's disappearance, about where exactly he had been. They questioned his timeline, finding inconsistencies between his current account and the one given 14 years earlier. He had once said he was in the East Wing. Now he claimed he had been finishing work near the gym. The discrepancies added to the pressure. He grew agitated, denying any involvement, insisting he had nothing to do with Ryan's death. But the most chilling detail remained his admission about the crawl space. For years, investigators had believed no one knew it existed, that it had been overlooked in ignorance. Now it was clear at least one person had known and had chosen not to mention it. Whether it was deliberate concealment or negligence, the effect had been the same. Ryan had remained hidden in plain sight, while his family and community searched endlessly. Theories among detectives solidified. If Ryan had been chased, the janitor's access and knowledge of the building made him a likely suspect. If Ryan had been forced into the crawl space, the janitor would have had the means and opportunity. Even if he hadn't physically placed Ryan there, his silence about the space raised damning questions about what he might have known. The town absorbed the revelations with a mix of outrage and despair. Parents who had once trusted the school system felt betrayed. Former students admitted their unease had always lingered, but now seemed justified. The Keller family, hearing the details, were devastated. Ryan's mother wept openly when she learned the man had known about the crawl space. His father sat in grim silence, his hands clenched. His sister, angry and exhausted, voiced what many were thinking. If the truth had been spoken 14 years ago, Ryan might have been found, and their family spared years of torment. Detectives debated their next steps carefully. Without a confession or physical evidence tying the janitor directly to Ryan's death, a prosecution would be difficult. But his admission cracked the narrative wide open. It meant Ryan's disappearance was not just an accident lost in time. Someone had known something vital and had chosen to say nothing. And while the janitor continued to deny involvement, his story was no longer intact. The cracks widened with each retelling, and investigators could sense he was holding something back. The truth, long hidden above the ceiling tiles, was beginning to surface again, this time through the words of the man who had once held the keys to every door in the building. In the end, the truth that had eluded the town for 14 years emerged with a grim, undeniable clarity. Detectives pieced together the final moments of Ryan Keller's life, not from witnesses, but from the evidence hidden above the ceiling. The crawl space, once a rumor, had become the scene of his death. Interviews, forensic findings, and the janitor's own admissions converged into one chilling conclusion. Ryan had never left the school. Investigators determined that after practice, Ryan was confronted in the locker room. Accounts from those who remembered the janitor's troubling behavior, combined with his access to the building, formed the framework of what happened. In a moment of fear, Ryan tried to escape, scrambling toward the only opening within reach, the ceiling void. But once inside, he found no exit, only darkness and suffocating confinement. Whether the janitor forced him up there or sealed the tiles after realizing Ryan had climbed in, the outcome was the same. Ryan was left trapped, unable to shout loud enough through pipes and beams to be heard. The janitor admitted knowing about the crawl space, but claimed he never thought investigators would search it. That silence was its own form of confession. The tiles had been replaced, the walls repainted, and the building renovated again and again, each layer of maintenance unknowingly entombing the boy deeper above the lockers. For more than a decade, his belongings and remains rested only feet above the heads of students who whispered about ghosts and banging pipes. For Ryan's family, the discovery was both unbearable and necessary. They were given the chance, at last, to bury their son properly, to place his name on a headstone rather than a flyer. But the years of silence could not be undone. His mother spoke of wasted time, of nights she believed he was still alive somewhere. His father admitted he had lived in quiet torment, never able to reconcile the absence. His sister, grown now, said the truth only confirmed what she had always known, that something inside that school had been concealed from the very beginning. The case was closed, but closure was impossible. Ryan Keller's disappearance had never been a mystery of the woods, or of strangers, or of the unknown. It had been a secret held just above their heads, hidden in the ceiling tiles of a locker room where a boy had walked in and never walked out.